My name is Carmi Palafox, an urban planner and economist. Welcome to Beyond Places, the podcast about the planning, design, and leadership of the communities and cities that we call home.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Beyond Places. I'm really excited to welcome my guest for today, and we're talking about the future of the workplace. So he is the country manager for Regis and Spaces by IWG, so that's the International Workplace Group, in several countries in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia. He is also vice president for sales in the ASEAN, so that's the Southeast Asian nations, Taiwan and South Korea, with over 175 centers in 25 cities. He's also an active member and speaker in various professional organizations, such as the Management Association of the Philippines and International Chambers of Commerce across Asia. Currently, he's director and vice president of European Chamber of Commerce Philippines. Welcome, Lars.
Thank you very much.
For those who are listening, can you please describe to us Regis, Spaces, and IWG?
Yeah, I think most people knows us by the brand Regis, and that was when the first center was opened just over 30 years ago in Brussels, back in Europe. There was a Regis center owned by our founding CEO, Mark Dixon, and ever since then it has grown to 3,500 locations. Over 120 countries, I think over 700 cities, I don't even remember it offhand. So by far the largest provider of flexible workspace as a service in the world. And we have multiple brands now to fit all needs, all requirements. And that has enabled us to make a network that is not just in the business centers downtown, but actually a very national networks.
So I've known you for many years, Lars, and that was when you were country head for Regis. So when, for example, Regis was started, what was the idea in terms of who the clients and customers would be?
Our founding CEO, as the entrepreneur that he was and still is, by the way, believe he was in the business back in Europe, and he suddenly needed a small office, and he realized how cumbersome it was. With the landlords, documentation, long-term liabilities, investments, and he really wanted to save his time, resources, not least money for his entrepreneurship and undertakings, and not running and setting up office. So he saw the opportunity and he started sharing offices with others as a service to the other companies availing of the same location, which actually still exists back in Brussels.
Since that time and today, has the kind of clients changed?
Yeah, I think so, very much actually. Back then, it was to a very high degree the smaller startups. It was the entrepreneurs, and then when they had grown to a certain size and that their businesses had more matured, and they felt that it was more predictable what their workspace requirements were going to be for the next 3, 5, 10 years, then they felt that they were able or ready for a conventional lease. Even when I joined this company about 8.5 years ago, when a customer moved out and I was challenged, why didn't they renew, Lars? If my answer was, oh, they went for conventional space, then that was never challenged again. And that has changed. I mean, now everybody are looking for the flexibility, regardless how big or small you are, because the speed of change is so rapid, so fast, it is impossible for a company to predict what are our workspace requirements 5 or 10 years from now. So they cannot log into any space, and that opens up for all companies, including the Fortune 500s, as well as the smallest startups.
So for example, the small startups, what's their minimum lease period?
Oh, it can be down to a few months. It could be that they just buy a membership. Maybe they don't want to have any workstation square meters yet, simply because they cannot afford it. Not afford it meaning not because it is expensive, because it is not, but they have to spend their time out chasing new customers. So they are out building their business, but they need to have their business registered. and they need to be registered and have a profile and a place where they even can meet with customers that is in a very relevant address and facilities. So in that sense, we make our customers look great to their customers.
And I think I recall you saying you actually had clients who ended up working together, because they also shared spaces.
Oh yeah, of course. And that kind of co-working is clearly something that we see emerging more and more. People want to socialize, but they also want to share knowledge and references, customers, suppliers, but probably more knowledge than anything else. Going back to the speed of change, the millennials and now soon the Generation Z also, but especially millennials, extremely successful, working whenever, wherever, all the time. And it can probably be argued that they are more successful than perhaps their age, their skills, and their experience justifies. So they like to interact with proud baby boomers like myself. But the fact is that if I don't interact with them, especially Generation Z, I can become obsolete overnight. And nowadays, we don't have the luxury of going back to the classroom to catch up. Well, not at all at the moment amid COVID-19, but even before COVID-19, we don't have that time, that luxury. The only way I can stay up to date, that is really from learning from them. So in that sense, it works very well, the way that we can complement each other in the co-working setting.
I think your companies have really transformed, the workplace. It's really, the pioneer in terms of flexible space. But in many ways, you also transform the traditional workplace. So, for example, let's talk about until pre-2019. So until 2019, for example, all the companies are like, let's be agile, let's be able to be nimble and have all these like open workspaces where employees have a choice. But since you joined, for example, 8.5 years ago until 2019, have there been changes to catch up with changing requirements of your clients?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that the average, first of all, the number of inquiries have just become so much greater. In the Philippines, number of incoming inquiries in 2012 were less than 100 inquiries per month. And today, even in the midst of COVID-19, we are welcoming about 150 plus new customers every single month based on almost 1,000 incoming inquiries. And pre-COVID-19, it was even higher. And of course, the number of inquiries will also bounce back again. But that alone has been a revolution. Before, people were not even aware about the concept. So this workspace revolution has taken place. Let me talk a little bit more about the workspace revolution. It really started with especially the young people that want to work whenever and wherever, and the more established companies, they just want to measure their employees with a timesheet and a middle manager looking over their shoulders. Now, if people don't want to be measured by a timesheet, etc., and whether or not a grumpy old office manager can spot them outside his office, then you as a company cannot attract the young talent. So that revolution, then it was like, well, we need to become more flexible, more relaxed in order to attract them. And then gradually it was learned by the employers from an HR point of view that actually allowing people to be able to work elsewhere more flexibly is actually quite viable. They're not losing productivity, stuck between point A and B, etc. So that was great. Then suddenly the CFOs, not just the HR manager, but the CFO also sees the benefit about not having long-term liabilities, capital investments. Fantastic. And as that took place, then finally even the developers, they wanted to embrace it in their buildings. And that is something relatively new. They were the last to recognize the trend. And that happened when approximately 3 years ago, big firms like JLL and PricewaterhouseCoopers, they all came out with projections that 30% of all office space, one way or the other, would become flexible by year 2030. That rang a bell with the developers, because if they didn't embrace that, then they would become as obsolete as if they forgot to put a reception at the bottom floor, forgot the elevators, forgot the parking. You had to include flexible workspace in every single building. And that is also what we have seen the last 2 or 3 years. There's never a new building being turned over without the element of flexible workspace.
So that projected increase by 2030, let's talk about, with COVID now, is that the same? Is it going to be fast-tracked, you think, or a little less?
It's definitely going to be fast-tracked. So this is like a time machine where we are taking a giant leap towards the future of the future predictions for year 2030. It will happen sooner. It will be the legacy of this otherwise crisis, that we are all learning the benefits and the opposite, but mostly benefits about being able to work from home or anywhere else that we want to drop into, and how unnecessary it is to force people to go typically for a commute from the outskirts or the provinces of a capital region, typically a major city, to travel all the way into the downtown CBDs in order to sit in the traditional head offices.
I think, yeah, you're right. And that could help level the playing field a bit. For example, so I'm an advisor to Palafox Associates. So it's a architecture planning company with offices in Makati, Cebu, and Davao. But because of COVID, a lot of the employees had to move. So there were people in Dumaguete and Pampanga and whatnot able to work on projects. Even me, based in Sydney, I'm able to be involved in projects. Given that, and I know, even pre-COVID, sorry to have to keep referring to that, you have really looked at bigger expansion because you've been doing so well. Are there locations that you didn't consider before but are now considering?
No, but that's because I already know what I want by year 2030. And specifically for the Philippines, I've been setting up distribution businesses here for Coca-Cola Company and Philip Morris cigarettes and so on. So I know exactly how to read a city, a municipality, and when it is ripe for our presence. That's also why we pioneered this business first into Cebu. We pioneered this business into Davao. But trust me, I made many trips to these cities and sat down with the local government, was driving around, counting gas stations, seeing whether there were McDonald's. If there was McDonald's, is there Burger King? If there's Burger King, is there Starbucks? And how many there are? Who are the developers, the investors? So I know how to sort of benchmark these things. And I'm very proud of the fact that we, with our multi-brands, have something that fits into the different tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3 cities. And most of all, thanks to the franchise model, now we have a franchisee in Davao, Damosa Land. We have a franchisee in Cebu, Apple One. And even amid COVID-19, there's great interest from potential franchisees. And that enables us to grow even faster into these tier 2 cities. I believe you're going to broadcast this beyond the Philippines. I'm not going to mention all the towns and cities that I want to be in and when, but there are always key indicators that you easily can go by for the city itself. And then after that, you go by other indicators, such as where are the car dealerships, etc., to find out exactly where you want to find a building that is right for you also. But that we can cover in a different program.
Is ease of doing business part of your criteria in selecting the city?
The ease of doing business is pretty much the same, I would say, in the top 15 cities. Where you find the biggest differences is actually within Metro Manila, which is comprised of 30 municipalities, which again is divided into clusters of 13 city halls. And they can be surprisingly different. But ease of doing business otherwise is very level playing field. Every single city has very good universities, etc. We are facing exactly the same challenges. Ease of doing business in many of my countries, not least the Philippines, is very, very difficult. And of course, in my line of business, that's fine because first of all, it's difficult for everybody. They don't make it difficult for somebody in particular. It doesn't matter whether you're a foreign company or a local company. We are all in the same boat, and we are like pulling our hair, and it's frustrating. But whenever there is a shortcut, of course, you are going to avail of that. We are such a shortcut. Just dealing with business permits in order to get your first office, that's, by the way, impossible. That's the chicken and the egg. So you need to start with an office address. That's us. And so there's a lot of logistics, a lot of ease that, you just come to us, then all of that is settled and you can go back and focus on your business.
Great. And you're handling several countries. So as I mentioned earlier, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, South Korea. Did I miss any?
Those countries I'm country manager for also, and then VP sales for those, plus Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia.
Are there similarities and stark differences among these countries in terms of, strategies and approaches moving forward in terms of recovery?
In terms of recovery, no, we are very much using the same approach, but of course the markets are affected extremely differently. I mean, it's really amazing how different it is. In some markets, we actually have higher occupancy, more workstations, more square meters occupied than same time last year. I can mention South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. I mean, that is impressive. And some smaller markets, Taiwan also, and Brunei. So, but it is not necessarily the exact, it is not as predictable occupancy as what we would or could have anticipated. There are definitely companies that have had to leave because they couldn't survive. So there have been more moving out, but we have also been able to replenish. So there's a different type of inquiries and demand, perhaps slightly slower, shorter terms than pre-COVID, perhaps slightly smaller inquiries than pre-COVID, but it is quite marginal, I would say. Among the markets within Southeast and East Asia that are the hardest hit, as I measure it, and my measurement is quite significant because I count in number of inquiries. Where the inquiries have dropped the most is definitely in the Philippines. Sad to say, Philippines is hit much harder for a much longer duration than the other markets.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're such an advocate for the Philippines. You're native from Denmark, but I see and hear you in a lot of fora and in media interviews, and you're really pro-Philippines. What do you think can be done by the business sector or people like me involved in the built environment?
Hopefully, a late stage of this crisis, meaning that we are not going to get any second waves. It is definitely easing up at least. And I hope that the government also this time will be quicker at easing up on the lockdowns, where we have seen in other markets, if you take Q2, came as a big surprise. Malaysia's GDP retracted more than the Philippines. The Philippines was only the second worst in ASEAN. But in Malaysia, all the time they've been waiting till last minute to lock down, and then they've been pretty quick at opening up again. And now, by the way, they have somewhat of a lockdown again from Kota Kinabalu all the way to Kuala Lumpur. But they adjust all the time, whereas we have been very conservative. We have seen a very conservative approach in the Philippines. And if the government is expecting all businesses to sit there and hold their breath for so long without turning blue, that's very naive. And it's very important that there is a pulse when you ease up again and when better times return. If there's no pulse, nobody will get back up and re-engage the fight. And it's very important, of course, that the Philippines can get more than just a fair share of better times when they return. And that's, of course, my biggest concern, is whether we have too little, too late to fight with.
Yeah, I mean, it's very unfortunate, really. And sometimes you're like, how do we even start in terms of, the Philippines post-recovery, and when is the big question mark, and there are so many unknowns beyond our control. Just thinking about, so as I mentioned, I'm based in Sydney, and here offices are required to have end-of-trip facilities, and many cities are encouraging that, many cities around the world. Do you reckon that this is something that, companies like yourselves or even traditional office providers can start, or how can more companies be encouraged to include that when they build buildings, to have end-of-trip facilities, for example, bike parking, shower facilities, just thinking about in terms of encouraging more people to bike to work, to walk to work?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question in the Philippines. When will people start biking to work here? It depends. It's different in the various markets. So I have not seen us changing much in our design right now, probably because our expansion model is changing. We are taking over more of competitor sites. Of course, the franchises, they are making the investment in lieu of us making the capital investment. There are other priorities right now, but and looking into the future, yeah, absolutely, it makes a lot of sense to consider that. And yes, even in Manila, there are actually many bicycles, at least compared to before, where there was pretty much zero bicycles.
Yes, because the frontliners don't have a choice, right? Because they cut down public transport. Well,
Yep.
Denmark is a leader in that, in terms of biking as a mode. So perhaps it's something you can influence Asia with.
Yeah, but we actually have a partnership with a bamboo bike down from
Oh, cool.
here in the Philippines, and I'm not too, well, it doesn't matter if I make some advertisement for them. It's a fantastic bike, and as a Dane, I actually drive a bamboo bike.
So what's the partnership?
Bike, yes, and the partnership is that we display their bikes in spaces, because it is really also very much a lifestyle icon, and it is a sustainable value chain where they are supporting the local, very local communities, driving their, supporting their economies too. So it is something that is a good talking point as well in our community areas, where we want to be the icebreaker so that people interact. And I tell you, a bamboo bike, that makes people talk.
Great. And then, because having, a Regis or Spaces in someone's town or city is a big plus. So what do you think, are requirements? Let's say there are cities who would like to encourage flexible office spaces to locate there. Is it
Yeah.
good internet connection? Is it access to public transport?
Well, the very important things is, of course, transportation. Transportation depends a lot on malls, as usual in the Philippines. So if there's a mall operator, then you also know that jeepneys and public transportation 24/7, by the way. So the malls and who are the mall investors, etc., are very deciding, surprisingly deciding. And then, of course, are there local universities and so on, and that generally they always are, all the way down to tier 3 cities like Dumaguete, excellent universities. So access to labor and perhaps less competition for the same labor, so people cannot as easily jump from one employer to the other. Then here amid COVID-19 is also interesting to see as the winners. There are winners amid this COVID-19, and that is the outskirts of the cities, the suburbs, the provinces. And we see that first and foremost with Clark. Why? Because you can actually drive to Clark from Manila. And since there are so many restrictions still in this country on domestic flights, that makes it an obvious first alternative to Metro Manila. As we become able to more easily fly around within the country, we will see it throughout all the other tier 2 and 3 cities.
It's interesting you mentioned Clark, because I have some friends in the Philippines who ask me, like, worst case scenario, if you couldn't live in Metro Manila, where would you live? And I say Clark. I also say Iloilo.
Yeah, Iloilo, I can follow you. Iloilo has always been very prosperous. That's another key indicator to go by. When I went to Iloilo first time was in 1992. And one of the things that I noticed back then was that it was the first time in a tier 2 city that I saw international bank branches outside the financial district of Makati. What I learned only recently is that the first HSBC branch in the Philippines was actually not in Metro Manila, it was down in Iloilo. So that is very telling. And then, of course, so there's a lot of old money there waiting to be invested, and now they've seen the light with BPOs and so on to make those investments, and there have been very good local government collaboration in Iloilo, where they've not been fighting each other, actually very much the opposite. So very impressed. I've always been very impressed by Iloilo. A good example, no doubt. I don't know why you would go to Clark, to be honest, because it's actually the hottest place in the country.
So, 2020 events have disrupted so many things around the world. But one thing is that it really threatened the very principles of city centers. So that is, city centers are great because of the agglomeration of people, of industry. High density is good. Accessibility because it's near transport hubs, and it helps to have people close to each other.
Yeah.
Do you think that will change? Will there be a balancing out of densities, you think? Like lesser density in CBDs and then higher? Okay.
For the first time, perhaps, since the industrialization began over 100 years ago, we are probably going to see more of an even out effect. And will we still need the downtown, traditional town areas? Well, I'm sure we will, with the stock exchanges, etc. Somewhat shopping and other good stuff. But there is no doubt that there's no reason to force people back in. And I think even those businesses that are doing fine, great now, they're not going to have the same type of workspace requirements when we come out on the other side. So these big Fortune 500 companies that the landlords think are the safest bets, their best and safest tenants, when they have their leases coming up for renewal, they might only renew 1/3, and then instead they're going to set up office hubs in the outskirts of the cities and in tier 2 cities. So that actually plays very much into our hands, because all this co-working boom that we saw within the last very few years before COVID-19, there was very big shared offices in the city centers. by having multiple brains like us, we can have spaces in the as the co-working ground zero in the CBDs, along with some HQs and Regises, and then Regises throughout the outskirts. And the further out you go, we have the HQ brain to fill in also. So that new work style again actually plays right into our concept. We are the only ones that are offering multiple brains.
There are many surveys across companies asking employees, will you go back to work? Do you prefer work from home? And what's coming out is the preferences for hybrid. And what it even means for a further hybrid is, for example, I work in, the main office in the city center in the CBD, but then sometimes I work in perhaps a satellite office in my suburb or in my secondary city, and then the rest of it is work from home.
Yeah.
So is there that kind of flexibility with their clients wherein they can work in different spaces?
That's exactly what it is all about. That is the core of the value proposition. And of course, it only makes sense the bigger and tighter your network is. And it makes sense for those that are based primarily out of the national capital region, but it certainly also makes sense for the local businesses in the tier 2 cities that can use the local offices of ours as a platform to avail of the network nationally and even internationally.
Lars, thanks for being such an advocate for the future of the workspace, for Asia and the Philippines in general. I hope you keep doing what you do. And if you have any last words.
It's always a pleasure to be able to talk with somebody like yourself, who knows the industry, but also, at many levels, you put your heart and your mind into infrastructure, work styles, architecture, urban planning, not least. And very much thanks to your global traveling. You're sitting in Sydney right now, and this Viking is sitting in Manila. So at least something good is coming out of us getting used to communicating this way. So I'm glad if I could contribute, and I would be delighted to if the opportunity should arise again.
Definitely. And when we're allowed to travel, I'll see you in Manila, in Australia, or somewhere else in Europe. For those who are listening and they'd like more information about your spaces, or they'd like to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Just go in and look for IWG PLC, and you can see our global network.
Great. I had so much fun talking to you, Lars. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Beyond Places. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to connect with me on social media and carmipalafox@gmail.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please do subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Bye and see you again next week.